4. That is the number of Mauritius kestrels left alive on Earth in 1974. Not 400, not 40. 4 individual birds clinging to existence on a tiny island in the Indian Ocean. The same island that already handed the world its most infamous extinction. The dodo, gone forever because of exactly what was now happening again. Scientists surveying Mauritius that year already knew it was bad. They were not prepared for just how bad. 4 birds meant no viable breeding population. It meant the math didn't work. It meant mainstream science had only one rational conclusion: write it off, accept it, move on. But in 1979, a 24-year-old Welshman named Carl Jones stepped onto that island and looked at those 4 birds and reached a completely different conclusion. Islands do something dangerous to life. Cut off from the rest of the world for millions of years, species evolve without natural predators. No reason to fear, no instinct to flee, no defense against what hasn't arrived yet. Mauritius was no different. Then humans came, and they brought everything with them: rats, mongooses, crab-eating macaques that could find a nest, crack it open, and be gone before anything could stop them. Then came the pesticides. DDT worked its way up the food chain, thinning eggshells so fragile that a mother bird sitting on her own eggs could crush them just by incubating them. Meanwhile, deforestation had stripped away the old trees, the ones with deep natural cavities where kestrels had always nested safely. There was nowhere left to breed. No shelter, no food chain intact, no protection from predators that had colonized every corner of the island. By 1974, the collapse wasn't gradual anymore. It was total. 4 birds and a scientific consensus that the Mauritius kestrel was functionally extinct, a species still breathing, but already gone in every way that mattered. What nobody could have predicted was that the very things that destroyed the population might also contain the clues to rebuilding it. The year was 1979. A 24-year-old Welshman named Carl Jones stepped off a plane in Mauritius carrying little more than field notebooks, a stubborn streak, and a mandate from the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust to figure out whether the kestrel could be saved. He was young, he was unknown, and he was about to walk directly into a fight with the most powerful conservation thinking of his era. The dominant philosophy at the time was essentially hands-off. Let nature run its course. If a species was in freefall, intervention risked making things worse, contaminating wild behavior, creating dependency, introducing disease. The scientific establishment had built walls around this idea, and those walls were thick. Respected institutions, respected people genuinely believed that the most ethical thing you could do for a dying species was watch it die cleanly rather than fumble it to death trying to help. Jones thought that was insane. His counter-argument was blunt, and it was logical. A species sitting at 4 individuals has already lost everything cautious management was designed to protect. There is no wild behavior left to contaminate. There is no population resilience left to preserve. When you are at 4, the risk of bold action is not that you might make things worse. It is that doing nothing guarantees the outcome everyone is trying to avoid. The mathematics of extinction are unforgiving, and Jones understood them in his bones. So he did what the establishment told him not to do. He climbed to the nests. Every breeding pair, all of them, because there were so few that every single one was a named individual with a known history, received his direct attention. He handled eggs. He tracked incubation times. He documented behavior at a level of personal physical intimacy that the hands-off crowd found almost offensive. This was not remote observation from a respectful distance. This was a man wedging himself into the daily reality of the last kestrels on Earth because he believed that understanding them completely was the only path forward. The pushback was immediate and it was serious. Colleagues questioned his methods. Institutions questioned his judgment. At one point, proposals circulated to abandon the Mauritius kestrel project entirely, to redirect the resources, accept the loss, and focus on species where the odds were less catastrophic. The kestrel was already being written off in committee rooms, while Jones was out in the field counting eggs. He kept going anyway. What drove him was not recklessness. It was a specific and disciplined belief that extinction is not inevitable until it is actually complete. That the job of a conservationist is to operate in the space between crisis and finality with every tool available. The Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, founded by Gerald Durrell on exactly this philosophy of hands-on intervention, had sent the right person to the right place. Jones was not improvising. He was applying a framework that the mainstream had not yet caught up to. 4 birds, 1 young scientist, and a scientific consensus telling him to stand down. What he did next would take that number somewhere no one thought possible. Picture a bird sitting on a clutch of eggs in a hollow tree deep in the fractured remnants of Mauritius's native forest. She does not know she is one of the last of her kind. She only knows what evolution has wired into her: incubate, protect, hatch, feed. And buried inside that same evolutionary wiring is a mechanism that Carl Jones recognized as the most important biological fact he had ever encountered. Many bird species, when their first clutch of eggs is removed early enough in the breeding season, will lay a second. It is a survival response, an ancient adaptation to nest predation. The female's body reads the loss of the first clutch as a failure and resets. She lays again. Under natural conditions, this might happen once in a rare season. Jones saw it for what it actually was. It was a lever. The technique is called double clutching, and the execution was precise. Jones and his team would locate a nest, remove the first clutch of eggs before incubation had progressed too far, and transfer those eggs to a captive incubation setup at their field station. The wild female, detecting the absence of her eggs, would cycle back into breeding condition and produce a second clutch. She would incubate and raise naturally in the wild. Meanwhile, the first clutch hatched under controlled conditions, and the chicks were hand-reared by Jones and his team before being released into suitable habitat. One breeding pair was now producing twice the offspring per season. In exceptional cases with careful timing and healthy females, the number pushed to triple the natural output, for a population that had been generating almost no successful offspring at all. Remember, just 4 individuals remained when Jones arrived. This was not a marginal improvement. It was a fundamental restructuring of the species' reproductive math. The chick rearing process was painstaking. Hand-reared kestrel chicks require feeding schedules measured in hours, not days. The team used puppets and careful behavioral conditioning to limit imprinting on humans, ensuring the birds that would eventually be released could function as wild animals rather than dependent ones. Every chick represented an enormous investment of time and expertise, and every chick that survived to release represented a measurable increase in a population that had been measured in single digits. Jones also attacked the housing problem directly. One of the reasons the kestrel population had collapsed so severely was the destruction of the old-growth forest trees that provided natural nest cavities. Those cavities take decades to form, and the trees that held them were largely gone. Jones's team installed artificial nest boxes across the remaining patches of suitable forest, purpose-built structures that replicated the dimensions and conditions of natural cavities. By 1984, those nest boxes were being actively used by breeding pairs, extending the effective range of viable nesting habitat beyond what the degraded forest could naturally support. The numbers that came out of these combined interventions were staggering in context. From a baseline of 4 birds and near zero annual recruitment, the population began to climb. Each breeding season produced more birds than the one before. The captive rearing facility that colleagues had once questioned the point of became the engine of a genuine recovery. By the mid-1980s, the Mauritius kestrel was no longer functionally extinct in any meaningful sense of the phrase. It was rebuilding. One removed clutch of eggs, transferred to a field station incubator, changed the trajectory of an entire species. But saving eggs was only half the equation, because the moment those captive reared chicks were strong enough to fly and were released back into the forest of Mauritius, they flew straight into the same gauntlet that had killed every generation before them. The predators were still there, the poisons were still in the soil, rats were still in the trees. If Carl Jones and his team solved the breeding problem but left the environment exactly as it was, they weren't saving the kestrel. They were just feeding it to the island's killing machine on a slight delay. So they went to war on 2 fronts simultaneously. The predator control operation that surrounded every active kestrel territory was not casual or occasional. It was relentless, systematic, and data-driven. Trapping grids were laid out across kestrel foraging zones, targeting the 2 species that had done the most damage across Mauritius's bird populations for centuries. Rats, which raided nests and consumed eggs and chicks whole, and mongooses, introduced to the island in the 1800s to control snakes, which had instead become one of the most destructive invasive predators in the Indian Ocean. Both species were trapped and removed continuously around territories where kestrels were nesting or had been released. This wasn't a one-time clearance. It was an ongoing commitment, season after season, because the moment pressure eased, populations rebounded within weeks. Nest box placement became its own discipline. The team didn't just put boxes up and hope for the best. Every box was positioned with predator access in mind, placed on structures and at heights that made it physically difficult for rats flats to reach. Smooth metal baffles were fitted to mounting poles. Locations were chosen to eliminate natural climbing routes. The engineering of a nest box in this context was as important as the biology inside it. Then there was the chemical environment. Pesticide use in Mauritius had been a major driver of the kestrel's original collapse. Organochlorine compounds, the same class of chemicals that devastated raptor populations across Europe and North America through the mid-20th century, had contaminated the kestrel's prey base across the island. Jones and the team pushed hard for pesticide restrictions inside active kestrel foraging zones. This meant confronting landowners, agricultural operations, and local authorities. It meant forcing land management practices to adapt around the recovery of a bird that most people on the island had never even seen. That kind of institutional friction doesn't resolve itself. It requires sustained pressure, documented evidence, and an argument that the species is worth the inconvenience. Jones made that argument repeatedly until it landed. What made this phase of the recovery genuinely difficult was the simultaneity of it all. Every variable that had caused the collapse had to be addressed at the same time, not sequentially. You couldn't fix predator pressure and ignore pesticides. You couldn't improve nesting success and release birds into uncontrolled territory. The system that had broken the kestrel was interconnected, and the system that would save it had to be equally interconnected. Jones understood this not as a complication, as the actual shape of the problem. Conservation done properly doesn't get to choose which threats to address first. The released birds, equipped with everything the captive program could give them, now had a fighting chance in a landscape that had been actively modified to receive them. Not perfect, not safe, but survivable. And that changed everything. Picture a whiteboard in a field station somewhere on Mauritius in 1993. On one side, written in marker that had probably been used and replaced a dozen times over the previous decade, a single number, 4. The population when the formal captive rearing program began in 1983. On the other side of that whiteboard, the number that ended the program, 333. That is not a typo. That is not a rounding. In 10 years, Carl Jones and the Mauritius Kestrel Recovery Team had taken a species down to its last 4 wild individuals and produced 333 captive reared birds. Within a single human decade, within the professional career of one man working on one island with a team that, at its core, was never large. The mechanism behind that number was everything described in the sections before this one. Double clutching, which pushed breeding pairs to produce 2 or 3 times their natural annual output. Captive incubation and hand rearing, which removed the mortality risk of the nest entirely for those additional clutches. Predator control, which gave released birds a survivable landscape instead of a death sentence. Pesticide management, which cleaned up the food chain those birds depended on. Each element compounded the others. Remove any one of them and the number on that whiteboard drops, possibly to 0. By the mid-1980s, the wild population had already begun climbing. Released birds were surviving. They were establishing territories. They were breeding. The feedback loop that had driven the species toward extinction was running in reverse, and it was accelerating. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, survey data from across the island showed a population that was not just persisting, but genuinely expanding. Territories that had been empty for years were being reoccupied. Pairs that had never existed in the wild were forming from released individuals and their offspring. By the time the formal program concluded in 1993, the wild population of Mauritius kestrels had climbed into the hundreds. Today, current estimates place that population somewhere between 400 and 800 individuals. The range reflects the genuine difficulty of counting a small falcon across a fragmented island landscape, but even the lower bound of that estimate represents an increase of 100 times over the 1974 low. 100 times. From 4 birds. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, which maintains the global red list of threatened species, formally downlisted the Mauritius kestrel from critically endangered. That downlisting is not a bureaucratic footnote. It is one of the most significant status changes in the recorded history of species conservation. Critically endangered means a species faces an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. Downlisting means that risk has been measurably, demonstrably reduced. It means the numbers moved in the right direction by a margin large enough to satisfy the most rigorous scientific criteria for recovery. In a field where success stories are rare and partial recoveries are celebrated as victories, what happened with the Mauritius kestrel sits in a category almost entirely by itself. 4 individuals in 1974, hundreds today, a formally revised conservation status, a method that worked when every expert said it couldn't. The number that changed everything wasn't 333, it was 4 because someone decided that 4 was enough to start. Jones didn't stop at the kestrel. He turned the same logic. He intervened early, intervened hard, on the echo parakeet, which had collapsed to fewer than 10 individuals, then the pink pigeon, then species after species that the conservation world had quietly written off. Every time the same playbook, every time it worked. Mauritius now prevents more bird extinctions per capita than any other nation on Earth. The island that gave the world its most famous extinction story became, against all odds, the global blueprint for stopping them. Conservation funding followed, ecotourism followed, the recovery paid for itself. What started as one man refusing to accept 4 birds as a death sentence became a model taught in wildlife programs worldwide. The kestrel case proves that collapse and extinction are not the same thing, but only if someone acts. Carl Jones, one person, limited funding, a remote island, reversed a trajectory that every expert called terminal. His interventionist model is now standard practice in island conservation globally. If you believe that matters, share this story with someone who needs to hear it.